Chapter 8. After an uneventful ride south on the 6 train, Nico and Will made their way to the southernmost edge of Central Park. Some of the leaves on the trees were beginning to turn yellow, and a light breeze rustled them. Joggers and cyclists zipped along the main road as Nico guided Will toward the woodland. When Nico stopped in front of a large grouping of boulders made up of Manhattan schist, Will raised an eyebrow. "Where do we go next?" he asked. Nico pointed at the rocks. "Through there." Will regarded the giant gray slabs. "Am I missing something?" "Nico, they're just rocks. What are we supposed to do?" "Oh, I am not doing anything," said Nico proudly. "I need you to sing." Will looked around him. "Is this a prank? Did you and Mr. D come up with this? Are there hidden cameras?" "I'm honored that you would think I'm capable of orchestrating a prophecy to pull off such a thing, but no, this isn't a joke. This is the literal door of Orpheus." "Oh," said Will, then, "Oh, so it's..." Nico nodded. "One of the only remaining secret entrances into the underworld." "Which Orpheus opened with music," said Will. "Exactly," said Nico. "You think you could give it a try?" Will took a deep breath. "Yeah, I can." "And then, that's it?" "That's it," Nico agreed. "Our journey can begin." Will turned around slowly, taking in the gorgeous Central Park trees that rose above them. "I don't know how long this adventure is going to take," he said as he spun. "So, first I just want to get a last look at everything, to recharge my internal battery." "You're cute when you're nervous." Will came to a stop, and Nico reached out to bring him into a hug. When they let go, Nico said, "We're going to be fine. Just keep in mind what Percy and Annabeth said. We'll stick close together, okay? I know the underworld well." "I'm not that worried about you," said Will. "I'm more freaked out about how I'm going to react. It's going to be dark, scary. I'll be surrounded by death and sadness and misery." "It's not all bad," said Nico. "Besides, our friends will help us." "The troglodytes, you mean?" Nico smiled, picturing the small, frog-like humanoids who would help them defeat Nero. "We'll be in good hands. Little webbed hands with lots of pointy claws." Will scratched his head. "Okay, I guess it'll be nice to see them. Are you sure they'll help us again, though?" "Well, why wouldn't they?" said Nico. "We kind of destroyed their home, didn't we?" "That was an accident, first of all. We had no idea the Tare Silvestris had followed us." "I know, but still, wouldn't you be mad if someone accidentally destroyed Camp Half-Blood by allowing mad bulls in to trample it?" "Second of all," said Nico, "I hope the Trogs find a new home." It took Will a moment to put the pieces together. "So, you're expecting them to help us? You found them a new home? You relocated them to the underworld?" Nico nodded. "They're even farther underground now and less likely to be found. As long as they stay out of my father's view, they'll be safer." Will shook his head, clearly mystified. "I don't understand how anyone could live down there." A burst of irritation jolted Nico's heart. He pressed his lips together so as to not blurt out his initial reaction, which wasn't very kind. "The underworld isn't what you think it is," he said quietly. "There's a lot more to it. You'll see." "Okay," said Will. "I trust you." This time when he smiled, it didn't really make Nico feel better. So Nico just stepped aside and gestured at the rocks. "A song, please." Will approached the massive boulders. He took another deep breath and started into a soft, winding melody. It was a familiar one to Nico. He'd heard Will sing it when he was using his healing abilities on someone. As Will's voice rose and fell, Nico saw small green shoots sprout up from the ground around him. A few of them bloomed yellow flowers. "Well, that's new," Nico said aloud to himself. No sooner had he uttered those words than the rocks groaned and shuddered. Will stopped singing and moved back, his eyes full of wonder, as a triangular crevice appeared, just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Inside, steps led down into deep darkness. Will covered his mouth and nose. "Ugh, what's that smell?" The odors hit Nico then. Mildew, decay, dust. Home. "That's the underworld." He drew his Stygian iron sword. "I'll go first." Will grabbed his arm. "Shouldn't I use my glow-in-the-dark power for more light?" Nico shook his head. "Save that for later. No sense draining yourself." There was a sheen of sweat on Will's forehead. "If you're sure." Rather than draw this out any longer, Nico reached down and grabbed Will's hand. "Come on," he said, and he led his boyfriend into the stairwell. After the first few steps, Nico glanced back to see the shape of Will's curls in the bright light of Central Park behind him. Then, with a loud groan, the crevice closed, and darkness swallowed the two demigods. Only the blade of Nico's sword cast any light, a dim purple glow that made the shadows feel even thicker. "Oh, wow," Will said. "It's really dark down here." Nico was ready to crack a terrible joke, but then a sensation of dread trickled over his skin. He raised his sword and peered into the gloom. The passage continued down as far as he could see, silent and empty. Nico, what is it? Something rustled in the darkness, but behind them, where the door of Orpheus had just closed. Nico spun, gently pushing Will to one side, and stuck his sword in that direction. There was nothing. What's happening? Will demanded. Nico brought his sword back close to his body. He turned to Will. I think you got me all amped up is all. I'm imagining things. Will didn't look convinced. Unfortunately, Nico wasn't sure he believed it either. Okay, Will said, but is it going to be this dark the whole time? Oh, no, not at all. We have to descend these steps for a while, but once we emerge in the underworld, well, you'll see. This is the only part without any light, at least before we get to Tartarus. Good to know, Will muttered. Nico headed down the narrow stairway and Will followed. The steps were much steeper than Nico would have liked, but that was mostly because he worried for Will. He could hear his boyfriend's footsteps echoing around him. Will was tapping his feet on every step to make sure it was solid. After a few minutes, Nico paused. You're nervous, he said. Just take the steps like you normally would. It'll be all right. Will started to answer, then stopped and looked behind him. Did you hear that? Hear what? Is something following us? Nico didn't hear anything this time. Maybe it's your imagination, said Nico. This place can feel very strange the first time. Okay, said Will, his voice shaky. Lead the way then. They continued. Will had Nico stop a few more times, but in each instance, Nico couldn't hear whatever his companion had, so they kept going, descending deeper and deeper. Nico knew that the stairway was lengthy, so he tried to remain as calm as possible as he put one foot in front of the other, careful not to slip on the slimy steps. It wasn't long before impatience began to creep along Nico's spine. He remembered descending these same steps years ago when he had led Percy to his father. The memory stung a little. He hadn't really wanted to betray Percy, but he needed to know more about his own childhood, which he'd lost in the River Lethe. But Nico recalled that it had maybe taken an hour or so to traverse the entire set of steps. Had it been an hour since Will parted the stones? Or had it been longer? Weren't journeys supposed to feel shorter when you'd done them before? Will echoed Nico's thoughts. How much farther do we have to go? He asked. I feel like we've been going down forever. I think we've got a bit more, Nico said, panting. His arm was tired from holding out his sword. The last time he'd made this journey, Percy had been the one to light the way. Funny how the older Nico got, the more he saw things about Percy differently. Like, I get that it's the underworld, said Will, so we have to go under the earth, but this... Shh! Nico froze so suddenly that Will ran into him. What is it? Whispered Will. Do you hear that? They both stood still. From somewhere ahead came a muted roar like a rainstorm against a metal roof. What is that? Asked Will. Nico smiled. That's the river Styx. We're almost there. The two of them forged ahead. Nico began to take the steps 2 at a time. He nearly slipped on one of the stones, then steadied himself and waited for Will to catch up. Soon a dim gray light filled the tunnel. Nico did his best to keep his cool as they continued their descent. The roar of the Styx turned from muted to thunderous. The steps started to level out. When Nico reached the bottom of the stairwell, he emerged into a large cavern lit by glowing stalactites overhead. To his right, the river Styx spilled over the edge of a towering climb and cascaded down a set of rocky rapids. And in the distance, the underworld. Fires guttered on the ramparts of the Erebos, the kingdom of death. Masses of ghosts converged on the great iron gates like a fog bank, clamoring to get in. Beyond those walls, Nico knew, lay the ghosts' final destinies. Elysium for the lucky few who had been virtuous in life, the fields of punishment for the wicked, and the bleak fields of asphodel for the indifferent and the neutral, which was most of humanity. Beyond those fields would be Hades' palace, all sharp angles and shadows. Nico was glad they were too far away to be able to make out any of those details. Will didn't need to see the fates of the dead. He was already nervous enough. Nico's head spun with exhaustion. For a moment, he thought he saw a dark shape in his peripheral vision, something strange and menacing, but when he turned, there was only Will. Welcome to the underworld, Nico said. Will frowned, then put a hand behind his head. He was still breathing heavily. Is this a joke? A joke? Nico was stunned. Why would you call my father's home a joke? What are you talking about? What are you talking about? You said we were here, said Will. We are. Nico spread his arms wide. Will fixed his eyes on the distance. No, we're not. Nico turned to look again, and what? They were back in the stairwell. The cavernous vista of Erebos was gone. The steps before them seemed to continue endlessly down into the darkness. No! Screamed Nico. What is happening? We just made it and... Can you hear that? Asked Will, cutting him off. The river? Because I can. They fell silent again. Sure enough, the distant rush of the river Styx echoed up through the tunnel. I don't understand, said Nico. I saw the underworld. I saw the river Styx and... Will sat down on the steps. There wasn't anything, Nico. It was just more stairs. That's impossible. That's not how this is supposed to work. Regardless, we're still not there. Do you think your father is trying to prevent us from entering the underworld? No, said Nico. Then I don't think so. He shouldn't even know that we're here. You sure about that? Said Will. Nico hesitated. Let's keep going. If I see the end of the tunnel again, I'll ask if you see it too. He helped Will up, and they pushed on. Nico wasn't positive, but it seemed like another hour passed before the sound of the sticks finally got louder and the tunnel filled with gray light once more. Nico reached back for Will, and his boyfriend's hand slipped into his. There, said Nico. Do you see that brightness ahead? After a short pause, Will said, Actually, yeah, I do. Okay, said Nico. Good. Let's keep moving. Moments later, as the darkness receded, Nico spotted the base of the steps. Can you see that? Nico said, pointing. Yes, Will said, breathless. It's the end. They rushed down the remaining steps and into the cavern. As before, the Styx' waterfall roared to Nico's right. Across the river loomed the burning ramparts of Erebos. Nico had this whole plan in his head to explain the geography of Erebos to Will so that he'd have some idea where they were heading, but when he turned to speak, his heart sank. It wasn't just Will's panicked expression that terrified him. Somehow, their surroundings had changed again. Nico couldn't believe it, but now they stood in the woods of Central Park in the dead of night. His heart racing, he pivoted and stared at the blank gray wall of schist that marked the door of Orpheus. There was a thump behind Nico. Will had fallen to his knees in the wet grass. Nico, he said desolately, what's happening?